If you've been in law school for more than a minute, you've probably heard students complain about the Bluebook. The Bluebook is the system of citation that we use in law. It is used not just by students, but by lawyers and practitioners. I am not going to stand here and defend the Bluebook to you. It is an incredibly annoying system. However, it is the system we have, and it is the system you are going to want to learn. I can tell you that a lot of employers will use writing samples when they are reviewing applications, right? When students apply to them for jobs. Some employers, not all, but some, will look at citations first because it's a very quick way for them to see if students understand the fundamentals or not, right? You can just quickly look at a citation without reading the actual text of the writing sample and see if this student is on the right track or not. They use it as a proxy for attention to detail. Do I think this is a good idea? No. But most of you don't know where you'll be working yet, either for your summer job or for your postgraduate employment. Some employers care a lot about legal citation, some don't care about it at all. So my recommendation is that you learn the parts of citation that you do need to know so that you can do well in your legal writing classes and do well in your summer employment. The good news is, of this giant Bluebook, there's very little you actually need to know. I make up all of my statistics because I'm a lawyer and not a statistician. But I'm going to say something like this. There's a small percentage of the Bluebook that I recommend that you memorize. These are the things that you're going to be doing frequently, both in school and in practice, and you're not going to want to be taking the time to look up those rules every time you need them. Small percentage you're going to memorize, and I'll tell you exactly how to do that portion in this video. There's an even smaller additional percentage of the Bluebook that you just want to remember that it exists and that you can look it up. The one thing the Bluebook does well is the index. So if you need to cite, for example, a dissenting or concurring opinion, you're not going to do that very often. I don't want you to memorize how to do it. I just want you to remember that it's a thing that exists, and on the rare occasion when you want to cite a dissent, you go to the index of the Bluebook and look up how to do it. The rest, and I'm going to call that 75%, no one cares about. You can completely ignore. With the caveat that if you want to be on a law journal, you will have to learn some of these additional rules that apply to academic writing, and that's nitpicky. But in terms of being an excellent lawyer or a judge, I'm going to tell you all the Bluebook parts you need to know. So, things that I think you should memorize just to make your life better, again, both in class and in practice. How to cite cases, both state cases and federal cases. How to use short cites for cases. How to use id, and how to cite statutes, both state and federal. I'm going to explain the first three of these in this video, and you'll learn about statutes in your legal writing classes. Happily, you can ignore the rest of the Bluebook. It's all nonsense. So let's talk about case citations. The easiest way to approach a case citation is to understand that it's made up of three different parts. You can see here that I have color-coded all of the parts, and I think the best way to approach these is to think of these as almost plug-and-play templates. You're going to get a new case, and you're going to plug in the parts of that citation into the template that I have given for you here. The first part of the template is the party names, the second part is the reporter information, and the third part is the court and year. Let's walk through each of these separately. The first section is the party names. Here, you're only going to include each party's last name. So if the people in this case were, Sue Fitzgerald suing John Kaplan, I'm only going to write Fitzgerald v. Kaplan here. If there are multiple parties, and this happens sometimes, 7 different people want to sue 4 different people, you still only list the first party name on each side, right? One name for the plaintiff, one name for the defendant. With the party names portion of your citation, you should either underline these or italicize them, but not both. My recommendation is to use italics. This is the more modern trend, but it is correct to underline if you prefer that. Then you'll follow these names with a comma. So Fitzgerald v. Kaplan, comma, all of that is in italics. The V and the period are also in italics. The second part of the information the second part of the citation is the reporter information. On my slide here, I have a photo of reporters in a law library. To really understand how reporter information works, you need to understand where they came from. Here I'm holding an example of a reporter. Reporters are the books that publish opinions of courts. So back in the day, people would go around literally on horseback to the different courthouses and pick up the opinions as the judges issued them. And then publishing companies would republish those legal opinions. And there were different competing publishing companies. So you might have one publishing company that published cases from all Arizona state courts, and another company that published opinions from Arizona and New Mexico, or again, various competing companies. So if I move to my next slide, you can see that to formulate the reporter portion of the slide, you want to have the volume number, the reporter abbreviation, and then the page number that the case begins on. Here's why I've brought my example reporter. You can see here on the spine that this is volume 874, right? So I would write 874. This is the Pacific Reporter, which is going to be abbreviated with a capital P, period. And then this is the Pacific Reporter second series. What that means is after the Pacific Reporter ran through volumes 1 through 999, they decided to start over. And so then they said, okay, we're going to start over with volume 1 of P second. And then once they hit 999, they started over with volume 1 of P third, for example. And then the last part of the reporter information is the page number that the case starts on. So you can understand now where this information comes from. I think if you understand what the rationale is for these numbers, it starts to make sense of something that otherwise might sound like a foreign language to you. So as I mentioned before, there still are multiple publishing companies. And so the same case might be published in multiple sources. We are going to use the Bluebook to figure out which of those sources you should cite to. Look at Table 1 of the Bluebook. In the newest edition of the Bluebook, Table 1 begins on page 257. And Arizona, for example, is on page 274. If I look up the Supreme Court of Arizona, the Bluebook tells me cite to P, P second, or P third if they're in. In its cryptic fashion, what this is telling me is that the Pacific Reporter, the P Reporter, is the preferred one. And if I'm able to find a citation to the P Reporter, I should use that one. For federal cases, they will all be reported in either the Federal Reporter, which is abbreviated with a capital F period. And again, we're now on actually the Federal Reporter 4th series, or the Federal Supplement, right? So same format of volume, reporter, page number. It's just that the reporter will be different. Of the many terrible rules in the Bluebook, I am sorry to tell you that the rules for spacing are the stupidest of all. The best way I have come up with to try and make sense of these rules is to think of them as sort of, if the letter is a singleton, you should close it up and there should not be any spaces around it. And if it has a longer abbreviation, you should have a space around it. Let's look at some examples. For example, SW second, which would be the Southwestern Reporter second series, would not have any spaces between it. There is not a space between S period and the capital W period. No spaces. On the other hand, SUP has 4 letters in it, so I'm going to put a space after F period space, SUP period space, second. The abbreviation for the Southern Reporter is capital S, little o, period. You're probably thinking, why is it not just S period when Southwestern was SW? I don't know. I told you, the Bluebook makes no sense. But because SO has 2 letters, we're going to put a space before we put the second. And if I'm writing Third Circuit, for example, again, it'll be third space before the CIR period. Again, I know it makes no sense. If you try and use logic, you will only frustrate yourself. Just try to memorize these rules because the only way to get through it is to memorize them. The third part of your citation is going to be the court name and the year. This part always goes in parentheses. And then remember that citations will always end with a period. So you'll end close parentheses, period. So some possible examples of this would be Arizona, 2002, Third Circuit, 1999. An example of a state case, an example of a federal case. To find how to abbreviate the name for a state court, we're going to go back to Table 1 of the Bluebook. If I start with Alabama, just because it's the first state, you can see here that the Supreme Court of Alabama is abbreviated ALA, period. Notice that I'm not putting in any kind of abbreviations for Supreme Court. There's no S, no C, nothing like that. The legally trained reader knows that ALA, period, means Supreme Court of Alabama and not just the state of Alabama. And then for all the other courts in the state, again, the abbreviations will be present in Table 1. To find federal court names, we're also going to look at Table 1. Beginning at the very beginning, page 257, you can see that the United States Supreme Court is abbreviated with capital U, period, S, period. The courts of appeals will be abbreviated, First Circuit, Second Circuit, Third Circuit, and so on. And district courts are abbreviated with a capital D, period, and then the abbreviation for the state. If you are trying to look up generic abbreviations for court names, such as Middle District or Southern District, you can find those in Table 7, which begins on page 336. In law, for reasons I have not been able to understand, we abbreviate second and third in a slightly funny way. You will write 2D and 3D instead of 2ND and 3RD. Notice that second and third are the only ones that are strange, right? So fourth is still normal. You shouldn't write 4D, but that's just a thing you should be aware of. The Bluebook prohibits what we call superscript, which is the tiny letters here. So when you write out fifth, you want to make sure that your TH comes across in ordinary font. If you're using Microsoft Word will often correct this to the superscript version. Microsoft Word is not the boss of you, so you are going to fix that. You can either change your autocorrect settings in Word, or you can do it the low-tech way and just go back and retype it. Either way, make sure that you avoid superscript. A pin cite is a cite to a particular page in a case. Some of these cases are very long. They could be more than 100 pages in some cases. And so a reader really appreciates it when you cite to a specific page of the case. Remember, I told you that the first number here is going to be the number that the case began on. So my Fitzgerald v. Kaplan case started on page 103. But if I want to tell the reader to refer to information specifically on page 108, the way I will do that is to write comma and then 108. That tells my reader this case began on page 103. I want you to refer to information to page 108. Federal case citations follow exactly the same format as state case citations. Volume, reporter, page number. Again, remember that the reporters will either be the F-Sup, the federal supplement for the federal district courts, the F series for the courts of appeals, and then the U.S. Court series, which was going to be used for the United States Supreme Court. There's a quirk in the citations for U.S. Supreme Court cases, and that is if the decision is published by the U.S. reporter, you don't include the court name in the parentheses section. It's the only time you will omit the name of the court from that section. Finding the page number. So here's an example of a case that I have printed from Lexis or Westlaw. They will give you very similar appearances, and it can be incredibly difficult to try and find the page numbers of these cases. Again, remember when I talked to you about competing publishers. You can think about it a little bit as the difference between a paperback version of a book, the hardbound version of a book, and the Kindle version of a book. They all publish the same words and in the same order, but the pagination is going to vary across the three versions. So, as I'm looking at this case, you can see here my citation info at the top. This gives me two different citation options. One is Kansas and one is P3rd. If I looked up Kansas in Table 1 of the Bluebook, it would tell me that this Pacific reporter, P, is the preferred reporter. And so I know that I'm going to cite to that version and not the Kansas version when I'm writing the citations in my memo or brief. So if I'm looking at this Pacific version, I see that 820 is the page number that the case began on. I now need to start looking through the text of the case to find where those pagination is going to happen. This can be, I'll be honest with you, pretty annoying. This particular case is actually quite difficult because 820 is pretty close to 798, which is the page number that the Kansas reporter starts on. So here you can see, for example, where you see the asterisk 799, that tells you that page 799 is starting here in that Kansas reporter. If I go to the next page, you can see here where you see asterisk 825. I know that that is the page number I'm looking for because I know that my case in the Pacific reporter is starting in those 820s. If I'm trying to cite information, let's say right here, I would cite to page 825. The 825 begins here, so everything under that I'm citing to page 825. Everything before this would be page 824, right? So everything on this column would all be 824. Again, my apologies, this is a ridiculous system, but it is the system we are stuck with. So, the good news is that you only need to give the full case citation once in any memo or brief that you write. After that, you're going to use either what we call a short form citation or an id cite. They are not interchangeable, so I will explain to you how to use each one and when you should use each one. To write a short form citation, you want to take just the first party name. So in my Fitzgerald v. Kaplan example, that would become just Fitzgerald. Then keep the volume and reporter, so 362 SE second, add the word at, and then put your pin cite, the page that you are citing to. So it's going to be at 108, not at 103, which was the page the case began on. There is an exception to this, which is if you are citing to criminal cases, one of the parties in a criminal case will always be the state or the prosecution. And so you need to use the defendant's name in the short cite, regardless of whether the defendant's name was the first name or the second name. So for example, if I'm citing to the State v. Walker case, my short cite would be Walker. The reason for this is if I were citing 15 different Kansas criminal cases, they would all have state as one of the parties. And so then the reader would be unable to distinguish which one was I referring to in my short cites. So I'm always going to use the defendant's name in the short cite for a criminal case. Id is an abbreviation for idem, which is a Latin word meaning the same. So if you want to cite the Fitzgerald case and then cite the Fitzgerald case again, you would use id, this abbreviation, to tell your reader that you are citing to the same case. The most important thing to understand about id is that it can only apply if you have no intervening citations. For example, if I have this Fitzgerald case and then I wanted to refer to the Smith case and then refer back to Fitzgerald, I could not use id because that Smith case was in between them. I would have to use a short cite. But here, in this example, I have Fitzgerald and then Fitzgerald again, so I will use id. If you want a citation to refer to the same case, the same page, you would use id. If you want to refer to the same case but a different page, you would do id at and then the new page number which you mean. Rules for id. You should underline or italicize id, including the period, whichever you have done with your party names. So if you put Fitzgerald v. Kaplan in italics, you should also put id in italics. Id follows the normal rules of capitalization. So you can see here that if I have id at the beginning of a citation, it is a capital I. But if I want to use a signal, like the word see, and I write C-id, then it would be a lowercase I. Because again, It's following the normal rules of capitalization, and here it's in the middle of a sentence. I can use id by itself, or I can use id at if I want to refer to id for a pin site. Here is a very important tip I recommend to you when you are working on your memo or brief. You want to keep track of the case where your information came from, and most importantly, the page number where you found that information. There is nothing worse than being almost finished with your assignment, ready to turn it in, but you're going back and trying to hunt through an opinion to find what page number was that stupid quote on. Keep track of your cases and page numbers as you are working. But I would not waste your time writing full formal citations or id cites and short cites until after your paper is almost final. And the reason for this is because if you decide to change things around, maybe move a sentence, move a paragraph, that's going to mess up your short cites and id cites, right? And then they'll be incorrect. So what I do when I'm writing something is I take just the first party name and the page number, and I put those in as placeholder citations. Something like Fitzgerald at 109. That tells me when I'm writing that came from my Fitzgerald v. Kaplan case at page 109. And then I just make sure that I save time to go back and format all of my citations later. But I won't have to go find that this was on page 109 as opposed to some other page. My final tip to you is to think of citations as sentences, right? And sentences always begin with a capital letter and end with a period. There are some additional nuances to citation that your legal writing professors will teach you, but this video will get you 95% of the way there. If you are frustrated by the Bluebook, remember, you are not alone, but you just have to accept your fate.